My daughter looked me in the eyes across a table set with crystal and white linen, smiled at her father-in-law, and told him I was confused about things I didn't understand. In front of 12 people who had never once asked my name, Audrey said those words about the woman who raised her alone for 22 years. I sat very still. I did not cry. Then the door at the far end of the dining room opened, and a woman in a gray blazer walked in, carrying a document folder thick enough to change everything in that room. If this story touches your heart, please stay with me until the end. And before we go any further, I'd love for you to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that we are never as alone as we sometimes feel. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been made to feel small by someone who should have protected you? Tell me where you're watching from. I read every message. People say the worst heartbreak is losing a spouse. I used to think that too. Then I watched my own daughter slowly become a stranger, and I understood there are losses that cut even deeper than grief. My name is Lorraine Holt. I am 64 years old, and I never imagined I would be the kind of woman who tells her story in public. I am not dramatic by nature. I am not someone who enjoys conflict. For most of my life, I kept my head down, worked hard, loved my family quietly, and believed that was enough. My husband, Franklin, died of a sudden heart attack when our daughter Audrey was 11 years old. One ordinary Thursday evening, he said he was going to lie down because his shoulder ached. By morning, he was gone. I still cannot explain what those first weeks felt like. There are no words adequate for that kind of loss. The particular silence of a house where someone who filled every room is suddenly nowhere. What I remember most is Audrey's face when I told her. She was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal, still in her pajamas with the little yellow ducks on them. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she set down her spoon very carefully, as though she needed to do one small thing correctly before everything else fell apart. That image has never left me. I don't think it ever will, I cried after she fell asleep that night. I gave myself until sunrise. Then I got up, made coffee, and started figuring out how to keep us alive. Franklin had life insurance, but it wasn't much. Enough to keep the mortgage current for a year, maybe 2 if I was careful. I went back to work full-time within the month. I had been a bookkeeper part-time before Audrey was born. I called every contact I had, took on 3 clients, then 4, then 6. I worked from the kitchen table after Audrey went to bed. I worked on weekends while she was at a friend's house. I bought her school clothes at end-of-season sales and told her it was because I liked a bargain, which wasn't entirely untrue. There were hard years and harder years. There was a winter when the furnace needed replacing, and I charged it to a credit card and paid it off over 14 months. There was a summer when Audrey wanted to go to an art camp in Vermont that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. I took on an extra client and didn't tell her why. She went to that camp. She came home with a sketchbook full of landscapes and a sunburn across her nose, and the look on her face was worth every hour of the extra work. Audrey was, for most of her childhood, genuinely wonderful. That is not the nostalgia of a grieving mother rewriting history. She was creative, curious, kind to people who were overlooked. Her teachers adored her. Her friends' mothers told me I was lucky. She called me her best friend until she was about 16, at which point I became merely tolerable, which I understood was entirely age-appropriate. What I did not expect was that she would eventually become someone I barely recognized. But that part of the story came later. For a long time, we were simply 2 people building a life together, in a house that smelled like her watercolors and my coffee. After Audrey graduated college, she moved to Charlotte for a graphic design position at a marketing firm. I missed her enormously, but I was proud. She called every few days. She came home for holidays and sometimes just because she wanted to. For 2 years, the distance between us was only geographic. Then she met her husband, Derek Whitfield. She called me on a Tuesday evening in October. Her voice had that particular energy I recognized from childhood, the sound she made when she had discovered something extraordinary. "Mom, I met someone." The way she said it. I smiled before she finished the sentence. She described him carefully. Smart, driven, funny in a dry way she appreciated. His family owned a commercial development company in Charlotte. That detail arrived casually as a footnote. At the time, I noted it the way you note the weather. Infertional. Not significant. I met Derek Whitfield 3 months later, when Audrey brought him home for Christmas. He was handsome in a careful way. Good manners, firm handshake, remembered details from conversations, and used them again later, which I initially read as attentiveness. He brought a bottle of wine that was clearly expensive. He helped clear the table without being asked. I liked him. I want to be honest about that. My first impression of Derek Whitfield was genuinely positive. It matters that I say so, because what came later was not something I recognized immediately. It crept in slowly, the way cold air comes through a window you forgot to fully close. The trouble began with his father. Harrison Whitfield ran the family business, Whitfield Development Group, from a glass and steel office building in uptown Charlotte. He had built the company over 30 years into something, with a long reach, commercial real estate, mixed-use developments, investment properties across 3 states. He was the kind of man who entered rooms already certain he was the most important person in them. The first time I met Harrison Whitfield, I extended my hand, and he shook it while looking past my shoulder. Not rudely, exactly. He simply had the manner of someone for whom other people are backdrop until proven otherwise. Audrey and Derek got engaged that spring. I was genuinely happy for them. The wedding planning began, and with it, the first small signs of something I could not quite name. Harrison offered to pay for the wedding. The offer was generous in its scope and controlling in its execution. He had opinions about the venue, the caterer, the guest list. He mentioned, twice, in my presence, that the venue Audrey originally wanted was charming, but perhaps not quite the right setting for the scale of celebration the Whitfield family typically hosted. I watched Audrey nod. I watched her not argue. I offered to contribute to the rehearsal dinner. Harrison smiled pleasantly and said that was already handled. The way he said it did not leave room for discussion. At the engagement party, held at the Whitfield family home, which was the kind of house that appears in architectural magazines, I was seated at a table near the edge of the room, with people I did not know. Audrey and Derek sat at the center table with Harrison and his wife, Miriam Whitfield, and their inner circle. I told myself the seating was logistical. I told myself a lot of things that evening. I overheard Harrison speaking to a business associate near the hallway. He was describing Derek's future within the company. The associate asked something I couldn't fully hear. Harrison responded with words I heard perfectly. Derek has always had good instincts, finding the right family to marry into matters more than people admit. He paused. Audrey is a good fit. Ambitious. Adaptable. He did not mention me. He did not mention Franklin. He spoke about my daughter the way you speak about a strategic acquisition. I drove home that night and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with small moments that accumulated like water finding cracks. Comments Harrison made about Audrey's background that reduced her entire history to a humble origin story, as though she had arrived from nowhere, rather than from a home where someone loved her fiercely and fought for her every single day. Suggestions about her career that implied graphic design was a fine hobby, but perhaps not in keeping with the profile of a Whitfield spouse. Silences from Audrey when I expected her to push back. Silences that grew longer each time. One afternoon I called her about a holiday visit. She sounded distracted. We talked for 12 minutes, and for 11 of them she was clearly doing something else. At the end she said, "Mom, you worry too much." "You always have." The words were not cruel. The tone was. It was Harrison's tone, I realized later. That polished, effortless dismissal dressed as concern. The wedding was beautiful. I will say that honestly. Audrey was radiant. Derek looked at her with something that appeared genuine. I cried during the ceremony, the good kind of crying. Whatever was wrong underneath the surface, that moment was real. But at the reception dinner, Harrison gave a toast. He spoke for nearly 8 minutes. He described Derek's character, his ambitions, his future. He welcomed Audrey warmly into the Whitfield family. He spoke about legacy and vision and the kind of life they would build together. He mentioned me once. Audrey's mother, Lorraine, who made the long drive from Raleigh. That was it. 12 words. After 22 years of being the only parent Audrey had. After every sacrifice that never got a name in a toast or anywhere else. I smiled. I raised my glass. I did not let anyone see what I felt. After the wedding, things moved faster. Derek rose quickly within his father's company. Audrey transitioned out of design work to support his schedule, his networking, his image. I understood the practical reasons. I did not fully understand, until later, how much of herself she was quietly setting aside. Our calls became shorter. My visits were planned far in advance, subject to the Whitfields' calendar. On Thanksgiving, Audrey and Derek went to Harrison's estate. I drove 4 hours to spend the holiday with my sister. Christmas was negotiated like a treaty. 2 days with the Whitfields, 1 afternoon with me, the arithmetic of which told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked. I kept telling myself it was temporary. New marriage, new family dynamics. These things take adjustment. I had heard that from other mothers. I believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative. Then came the dinner. Harrison organized what he called a family vision gathering, his term, an annual event where the Whitfield family, their key partners, their inner circle assembled at his estate to discuss the year ahead. Audrey mentioned I was invited. The way she mentioned it quickly, almost as an afterthought, should have told me something. I drove down on a Friday evening. The Whitfield estate in the foothills outside Charlotte occupied land that looked like a private park. Immaculate. Enormous, the kind of property that announces its own importance before you reach the front door. Inside, I found myself surrounded by people who all seemed to know each other well. Business partners, old money families, people for whom this gathering was a familiar ritual, and for whom I was clearly a novelty. A few were friendly. Most were polite in the way that costs nothing. I found Audrey near the back of the main room. She hugged me briefly. I noticed her eyes moving past my shoulder as she did, scanning for someone else. Dinner was served in a long, formal dining room. I was seated near the end of the table, 11 chairs from my daughter. Harrison occupied the center, naturally. Derek sat beside him. Audrey sat beside Derek. The geometry of the room said everything. Harrison led the dinner conversation. He was skilled at it, that particular kind of authority that makes every topic feel like his territory. At one point, someone asked Derek about his trajectory within the company. Harrison answered before Derek could. Derek is being positioned for a significant leadership role. He paused for effect. He's grown considerably in the past 2 years. He has the right environment now. The right environment. I thought of Audrey. I thought of everything she had shifted and softened and set down to become part of this environment. Later in the meal, someone asked Audrey how she and Derek had built such a strong foundation so quickly. Before Audrey could answer, Harrison spoke. Audrey understood early that a good marriage is a shared vision. He smiled at her. She's adapted beautifully. The word adapted hung in the air, like something wild that had been trained. I excused myself between courses and walked down a hallway toward the powder room. As I passed a partially open study door, I heard voices. Harrison's voice, immediately recognizable. Then Audrey's. I stopped. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I simply stopped because I heard my daughter's voice, and something in its tone caught me. She was saying, "I just think she doesn't always understand the context here." A pause. Harrison responded, "Of course. That's natural." Another pause. Then Audrey said something that entered me like a sliver of glass and has never fully come out. "She means well, but she can make things awkward." Harrison chuckled softly. "These transitions take time," he said. Audrey answered, "I know. I just don't want her presence to complicate things with the Halverson group next weekend." I stood in the hallway. I did not move for a long moment. My own daughter. Discussing whether my presence would complicate things. Discussing me the way you discuss a logistical variable. A scheduling concern. I walked back to the dining table. I finished dinner. I said goodnight to people whose names I had already forgotten. I hugged Audrey at the door. She held on for a second longer than usual, and I wondered if some part of her knew something had shifted. On the drive home, I thought about Franklin. I thought about what he would say. I thought about the yellow duck pajamas. I thought about the art camp in Vermont and the sketchbook she brought home and the look on her face. I did not sleep that night. 3 days later, I called my old friend Cecilia Marsh. We had known each other for nearly 30 years. Her late husband had been a corporate attorney, and after his death, she had stayed connected to his professional network. I didn't call her for legal reasons. I called because I needed to talk to someone who knew both me and Franklin and wouldn't require me to explain the history. We met for coffee. I told her what had happened at the dinner. I told her about the hallway. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked something I hadn't expected. Lorraine, did Franklin ever mention a man named Garrison Webb? The name hit me oddly, not with full recognition, but with the feeling of something half-remembered. Something from long ago, I thought. Then I said, once, maybe twice, something about a business matter before Audrey was born. Cecilia nodded slowly. The two of them were involved in a project together, a development project. Commercial real estate. I stared at her. Franklin wasn't in real estate. She folded her hands on the table. Not as his primary work, but he had an interest in a joint venture. A small percentage of an early deal. She paused. Lorraine, Garrison Webb was Harrison Whitfield's original business partner. I sat with that for a long moment. The coffee cup in my hand felt very heavy. What kind of interest? I asked. She shook her head gently. I don't know the details, but my husband mentioned it once, years ago after Franklin passed. He said there were loose ends that had never been properly settled, that someone should have told you, but it never happened. I drove home, very slowly, that afternoon. That evening, I opened the metal filing box I kept in the back of my closet. Franklin had been organized in the specific way of people who expect to be around to use their organizational systems. There were folders for everything: insurance, property, medical, financial. In a folder labeled MISC, business, near the bottom of the box, I found a document I had never seen before. Or perhaps I had seen it and not understood what it was. It was a partnership agreement. 3 names on the original signature page: Lorraine Holt, Garrison Webb, and a third name I had to read twice before it registered: Harrison Whitfield. I sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. The document was dated 28 years earlier. The venture was a commercial development project in Mecklenburg County. The ownership split was spelled out clearly. Franklin held a 15% interest in what became the foundation of what Whitfield Development Group eventually grew into. 15% of a company that now operated across 3 states. I called Cecilia back that same night. She listened. When I finished, there was silence. Then she said, carefully, Lorraine, I think you need an attorney. I found Annalise Tran through a referral from Cecilia's network, a women's estate and business attorney, sharp and specific, with an office in Raleigh that smelled like real wood and good coffee. When I sat across from her and slid the partnership documents across her desks, she read without speaking for several minutes. When she looked up, her expression was professional, but her eyes were very focused. This is a valid executed agreement, she said. I nodded. I know. She tapped the 3rd signature. You're aware of his current position, Harrison Whitfield? Yes, he's my daughter's father-in-law. A beat. She studied me. That's a significant complication, I said. I'm aware. Over the following 3 weeks, Annalise and her team traced the corporate history of the original venture, its absorption into early Whitfield development entities, the restructuring that happened in the decade after it closed, and most critically, the question of what happened to Franklin's interest at the time of his death. What she found was not simple. Franklin's interest had not been properly dissolved at his death. There had been an agreement drafted between Harrison and Garrison Webb 2 months after Franklin died that purported to absorb Franklin's share into the remaining partnership. The document was signed by Harrison and Webb. It was not signed by me, Franklin's surviving spouse and legal heir. It had been filed quietly, in the ordinary course of business, with no apparent attempt to notify me. Either someone had decided I didn't need to know, or someone had decided it was better if I didn't. There was also a letter. Annalise found it in corporate filing records, a letter Franklin had written to his attorney at the time, dictated during his final weeks in the hospital. It had been sent but never acted upon. In it, Franklin stated clearly that he wanted his interest in the venture protected for Audrey's benefit. I read a copy of that letter 3 times, sitting in Annalise's office. Franklin's voice was in every sentence. Careful, precise. Thinking about Audrey even then, the last line nearly undid me. He had written, "If anything is unclear after I'm gone, please ensure that Lorraine is made aware." She'll know what to do. I sat in Annalise's office for a long moment after I finished reading. She waited. Then she said, quietly, "He trusted you, I know." I looked at the window. He always did. She gave me time. Then she outlined what we were looking at. The dissolution of Franklin's interest had been legally irregular, potentially challengeable. The value of that interest, traced forward through 30 years of growth, was not a small sum. I didn't ask for the number that day. I asked one question instead. How did Harrisons not think this would eventually surface? Annalise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "People who build things tend to believe they control all the pieces. He may have assumed that a widowed woman with a young child and no business background would never know to look." He was probably right, I said. If Audrey hadn't married Derek, I never would have. She nodded. But she did. We spent the next month preparing. I told no one. Not Audrey. Not my sister. Not anyone except Cecilia, who already knew the beginning of the story, and who kept the rest of it with the discretion of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. During that month, Audrey called twice. Once to discuss Thanksgiving plans. Once to tell me that she and Derek were thinking about buying a house, and that Harrison was helping them with the financing. She sounded happy. She sounded completely inside the world the Whitfields had built around her. I listened. I was warm. I said all the right things, and when I hung up the phone, I sat with the particular silence of a person who knows something no one else in the room knows yet. Harrison organized a company anniversary gala at the end of that November. Whitfield Development Group, 30 years. The event was held at a hotel ballroom in uptown Charlotte. Clients, investors, political contacts, press. The kind of event designed to celebrate a legacy. Audrey called to invite me. Her voice was careful, as though she'd been told to make the call rather than decide it herself. I said I would love to come. When I arrived, the ballroom was full of the kind of people who attend Harrison Whitfield's events. I knew almost none of them. I found Audrey near the center of the room. She looked beautiful. She also looked slightly startled to actually see me. "Mom!" She hugged me. "I'm so glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and meant it more than she knew. Derek greeted me politely. Harrison, when he saw me across the room, nodded. Cordial, brief, the nod of a man who considers a situation managed. The program began. Harrison took the stage. He spoke about 30 years of building, about vision and risk and the loyalty of partners. He spoke beautifully. I will give him that. He was a skilled public narrator of his own story. He spoke about the early days of the company, the first projects, the foundation. He named the people who had helped build it. He did not name Franklin. He did not name Garrison Webb. For that matter, though Garrison had been his original co-founder and had died several years prior. Harrison had long since constructed a version of his own history in which he had built everything himself from his own effort and vision. It was a clean story, compelling, even, and it had worked for 30 years because no one with standing had ever challenged it. Then the side door of the ballroom opened. Annalise Tran walked in with 2 colleagues. She was dressed simply. Professional. She did not look dramatic. She simply walked toward the front of the room and stood, quietly, while Harrison was still at the podium. He saw her. I watched the recognition cross his face. Then I watched him not know what to do with it, which was a thing I had never seen from him before. Annalise addressed the room. "Excuse the interruption," she said. She had a voice that did not need to be loud to be heard. "I'm Annalise Tran. I represent the estate interests of Franklin Holt. And I represent Lorraine Holt." The room went still. Audrey turned toward me. Her face was unreadable for a moment. Then it became something I could only describe as complicated. Annalise continued. "There are matters of legal record regarding the founding structure of Whitfield Development Group that have not been publicly acknowledged." She placed a folder on the table near the podium. "We are here to ensure that they are." Harrison stepped away from the microphone. His voice was even. "Whatever you believe you have found, this is not the appropriate venue." Annalise looked at him steadily. "Given that this event is celebrating a corporate history that involves these matters directly, I believe it is precisely the appropriate venue." A murmur moved through the room. She presented the original partnership agreement. The 3 signatures, Franklin's name, his interest percentage, his documented right to participation in the venture that became the company, Harrison was currently celebrating. She presented the letter Annalise's team had found from Franklin's attorney files, establishing Franklin's intent. She presented the 1997 dissolution agreement between Harrison and Webb. The one that had simply not included me. She was methodical. She was not cruel. She did not editorialize. She presented facts in sequence, and facts, delivered calmly, do not require drama. The investors in the room grew visibly uncomfortable. 2 board members I later learned were board members exchanged a long look. Several reporters had notebooks out. Harrison attempted a response. He said the original interest had been dissolved according to terms agreed upon at the time. Annalise said, "The surviving spouse was not party to that dissolution, and did not consent to it." She paused. "The legal record does not support the position that the interest was legitimately transferred." Derek stood. His face was tight. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. Something between anger and something else. I looked back at him without flinching. Then Audrey stood. She looked at her father-in-law. She looked at me. She looked back at Harrison. She said, quietly enough that only the nearest tables heard, "Is this true?" Harrison did not answer immediately. That hesitation was its own answer. "Harrison," she said it again, flat, direct. He said, "These things are more complex than they appear." I had heard those words before, in different forms, from different people. They always mean the same thing. Audrey sat back down slowly. She did not look at Derek. She looked at her hands on the table in front of her. I stood. The room's attention shifted to me. I had thought about what I might say if I spoke. I had not prepared remarks. What came out was not a speech. It was simply the truth, said plainly. "My husband built something," I said. "He built it quietly, without needing credit for it. He built it while also building a life with me, and building a daughter who grew up knowing that integrity mattered. He died before he could protect what he'd worked for. I spent 20 years not knowing there was anything to protect." I looked at Harrison. "I am not here for revenge." I said it clearly because I meant it. "I'm here because my husband's name deserved to be in the room when this company celebrated its history, and because his daughter deserved to know the truth about her father." Silence. I sat down. The evening ended not with a toast but with quiet dispersal. Reporters followed Annalise. Investors huddled in small groups. Harrison left through a side exit, flanked by his personal attorney. Derek found me near the coat room. He looked like a man trying to organize himself quickly. "Mrs. Holt, I want you to know that I had no idea." I believed him. I still believe him. Derek Whitfield is not his father. He is shaped by his father's world, which is a different thing. "I know," I said. I held his gaze. "Take care of my daughter." He nodded. Something in his face softened. Audrey came to me last. The room had mostly emptied. She walked over slowly, and when she reached me, she did not say anything for a long moment. Just stood there. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my daughter. I had asked myself the same question many times. "Because you were happy," I said, "and I needed to know what I was dealing with before I brought it to you." Her eyes filled, not dramatically, the quiet kind. She said, "I said things about you at that dinner, in the hallway." "I know." She closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry, I know that too." We stood there in the nearly empty ballroom, the two of us, in the quiet aftermath of 30 years of hidden history. I reached out and held her hand. The same hand I had held crossing parking lots and through hospital waiting rooms, and on the first day of kindergarten when she cried and I pretended not to. "We're going to be okay," I said. She squeezed my fingers. She didn't answer, but she didn't let go either. The legal process took several more months. I will not pretend it was simple or clean. There were depositions. There were contested positions. Harrison retained a team of attorneys who were skilled and expensive and did their jobs thoroughly. But Annalise had built a case on 30 years of documented record. And documented record is a patient argument. In the end, an agreement was reached. Not everything I might have technically been entitled to pursue, but enough. Enough to be meaningful. Enough to be real. Enough to feel, for the first time in 20 years, like what Franklin had worked for had not simply disappeared into someone else's ledger. I set aside a significant portion for a fund I established in Franklin's name, the Lorraine Holt Opportunity Fund, directed toward children who have lost a parent and need support to pursue education and creative work. Audrey designed the logo. She worked on it for a week. She brought 3 versions to my kitchen table one afternoon and spread them out, and asked me which one felt most like him. I pointed to the second one. Simple, clean, nothing extra. That's what I thought too, she said. There is something I want to say honestly about Audrey. Rebuilding what we had did not happen quickly. You cannot undo certain moments by explaining them, or by apologizing, or even by following apology with changed behavior. Those things help. They are necessary, but time is also part of it. A lot of time. What I can say is that Audrey tried. She tried in the specific, practical ways that matter more than grand gestures. She called regularly, not out of obligation, but with actual things to say. She showed up for the minor things. The dentist appointment no one expects company. 4. The afternoon I needed help moving furniture, and said I could manage myself, and she came anyway. She stopped performing versions of herself, designed for Harrison's approval, and started being, again, more simply herself. Derek, for his part, was navigating his own complicated reckoning. His relationship with his father changed considerably. I do not know the details of those conversations, and I did not ask. What I observed from the outside was a man doing the harder, slower work of seeing his father clearly without being destroyed by what he saw. That work takes courage. I gave him credit for it. Harrison and I have not spoken since the evening of the gala. I have not sought that conversation, and I do not expect him to. Some reckonings are completed in public record and legal resolution. They do not require a private epilogue. Miriam Whitfield sent me a card about a year later. Just a notacard, handwritten. It said, "I believe you were owed more than you received. I'm sorry I wasn't paying better attention. I appreciated that more than she probably knows." What I think about now, more than any of the legal or family or financial details of everything that happened, is Franklin. I think about him sitting in a hospital bed in the last weeks of his life, dictating a letter to his attorney, trying to tie up the loose ends he could see clearly even when he could barely sit up on his own. Thinking about Audrey. Thinking about making sure I was informed, not asking for recognition, not demanding that his name be preserved. Simply trying to make sure his family was protected. He spent his whole life that way. Building things quietly, caring about whether the work was done right rather than whether anyone knew he'd done it. I used to think that was just his personality. Now I think it was something he understood about integrity that I am still learning. The work matters. The credit is secondary. What you build for other people outlasts what you build for yourself. The Lorraine Holt Opportunity Fund made its first awards last spring. 8 students. 3 of them had lost a parent before they finished high school. All 8 were pursuing something they cared about. At the small ceremony we held in Raleigh, I looked out at those 8 faces and thought about an 11-year-old girl setting down a cereal spoon very carefully before the world changed. I thought about what it means to be cared for by someone who asks nothing in return. Audrey stood beside me at that ceremony. At one point she leaned over and said quietly, "He would have loved this." I looked at her. "He already does," I said. A few weeks ago, I updated my estate plans for what I hope is the last significant time for a while. Annalise reviewed everything. When we finished, she walked me to the door and said, "Franklin would be glad you figured it out." I laughed. "He'd say it took long enough." She smiled. "He'd also say you handled it the way he would have wanted." I drove home through the October evening with the windows slightly down, the way I do when the air is exactly right. I thought about the filing box in the back of my closet and the document in the MISC business folder that changed everything. I thought about Cecilia, asking if I knew the name Garrison Webb over coffee in the kind of ordinary moment that turns out to be a hinge point. I thought about the ballroom, about Annalise walking through the side door, about the look on Harrison's face in the moment before he knew what to do with it. Mostly I thought about Audrey and the way she held my hand in that empty room and didn't let go. Some stories about betrayal end with the person who was betrayed becoming harder, closing off. Deciding the world is a place that punishes trust, and therefore trust should be rationed carefully going forward. I understand that ending. I almost chose it. But here is what I know now. Having lived 64 years and raised one daughter through grief and distance and a season that nearly broke what we'd built. The people who love you imperfectly, and then do the work to love you better, are more valuable than anything that can be resolved in a courtroom. The money mattered. The record being corrected mattered. Franklin's name being said aloud in that room mattered enormously. But what I carry with me out of all of it is not the settlement. It is an afternoon in my kitchen with my daughter's hands spread across 3 versions of a logo, asking me which one felt most like her father. Getting that afternoon back was worth everything it took to get here.